Imagine sitting in a cold cell, innocent but sentenced to die. That's where Nick Yaris found himself, a young man trapped by lies, lost evidence, and a justice system determined to punish, not protect. For over 2 decades he faced the pain of isolation, violent threats, and a future as bleak as steel bars. Nick's story isn't just legal drama. It's betrayal, heartbreak, and the stubborn hope of a man who refused to be erased. With every failed appeal and lonely hour, anger and sorrow grew. But somewhere in the dark, Nick found his voice, a voice weathered by rage, but never broken. If you care about true crime and tales of survival, this story will grip you at every turn. It's about loss, love, shattered trust, and a fight that didn't end at freedom's door. For anyone who believes in the power of truth, Nick's journey will stay with you long after you close the page. Before the nightmare, the life of Nick Yaris. Every nightmare has a beginning, and Nick Yaris's story started long before a jail cell or a day in court. His pain did not emerge from a headline. He was marked by struggle from the start. To understand how his wrongful imprisonment unfolded, you first need to know the boy he was, what he survived, and how luck and pain pulled him toward tragedy with an almost magnetic force. Troubled youth and early struggles. Nick Yaris grew up just outside Philadelphia, one of 6 children. From the outside, you might have seen an ordinary American family, but inside those walls, life had a sharper edge. When Nick was 7, a violent event scarred his childhood. He was the victim of a brutal assault, an attack that would haunt him for decades. Instead of finding support, Nick began to unravel. The trauma, mixed with the confusion of a young mind, left him anxious and angry. By his teen years, Nick fell in with the wrong crowd and found escape in drugs and alcohol. He described himself as reckless, a risk-taker who felt invisible and wouldn't back down from a fight or bad decision. As a young man, Nick's life began to spiral. He bounced between arrests for petty crimes like shoplifting and fighting. He used substances daily to mask emotional pain. By age 20, he was deep in addiction, and trouble nearly found him everywhere. Nick often reflected, "I was a mess, broken on the inside. Drugs made everything feel far away, like watching my life on an old TV no one wanted to fix." Friends watched as Nick became someone most people avoided. Police saw him more as a headache than a lost young man. Yet underneath it all, Nick still wanted acceptance. He struggled with feelings of never measuring up, never truly belonging. That insecurity, the kind that makes you desperate to be noticed, even for the wrong reasons, played a tragic role in what would come next. The crime that changed everything. On December 16, 1981, Linda Mae Craig vanished from a Delaware County shopping center. Days later, her body was found in Pennsylvania. She had been violently assaulted and murdered. The case struck fear through the community. Police scrambled for leads, but nothing pointed to a clear suspect. Meanwhile, Nick was already in trouble. He'd been picked up on an unrelated charge after a chaotic traffic stop, turned into a struggle with officers. Sitting in a cell, shaking from withdrawal, Nick heard rumors of the murder but couldn't have guessed his life was about to get ripped apart. Desperate to get out from under his own arrest, Nick made a split-second decision that changed his life. He claimed to know who killed Linda Mae Craig, hoping it would help him cut a deal with authorities. His plan backfired tragically. Investigators quickly tested the name he'd provided and found nothing. But now Nick had inserted himself into the narrative. Suddenly, suspicion shifted his way. The wolf pack of fate started to circle. Nick later described that moment. "I thought if I gave them a name, they'd let me go. But the name I picked was an innocent man." When that didn't pan out, It was like the room got smaller. Suddenly, they turned to me, interrogations grew more hostile. Under pressure and in a fog of fear, Nick became their main suspect. With little more than circumstantial evidence and the word of jailhouse informants desperate for their own deals, prosecutors built their case. Nick was soon facing the unthinkable, a charge of kidnapping, rape, and murder. Innocence became a distant memory. Every moment of his troubled past each arrest, every bad decision became fuel for the justice system determined to make someone pay. And for Nick Yaris, fate had picked him as the scapegoat. The nightmare had only just begun. Wrongful arrest, and the road to death row. Nick Yaris's nightmare did not begin with a crime of violence, but with a desperate, misguided effort to lessen his own troubles. What unfolded next became a tragic example of how one moment of panic, a broken system, and a handful of lies could send an innocent man straight to death row. This part of Nick's journey reveals the astonishing pain, fear, and mistakes that shaped the path to his near execution. A Lie Turns Deadly share details of Nick's attempt to cut a deal with authorities, which backfired and ultimately turned him into the main suspect. Trapped in a holding cell, sick from withdrawal and terrified of new charges, Nick Yaris did something many people might have done in his place. He tried to talk his way out. He believed if he could give police a name, tell them what they wanted to hear, maybe they'd cut a deal and let him go in a haze. He pointed the finger at someone else, a name pulled from the rumor chain of jail life, not because it was true, but because it was available. But the name didn't stick. Police immediately checked his claim and realized he was lying. That moment changed everything. The investigators' questions turned cold. The deal vanished. Suddenly, their gazes sharpened, hungry for an answer. And Nick was the only one left inside the crosshairs. The shift was instant and brutal. Detectives stopped searching for other suspects. Every hint of Nick's nervousness was seen as guilt. His history of arrests and addiction painted him as a believable villain. Nick once described that moment as feeling like the temperature dropped to freezing. In the interview room, I felt the floor drop out beneath me. Suddenly, every word I'd ever said or every fight I'd ever had made me look like a monster. Instead of freedom, Nick's offhand lie sealed his fate. Informants and a jail-eager for their own. Lenients lined up to testify against him. Evidence that could have cleared him was pushed aside. Nick's attempt at self-preservation had become the noose tightening around his own neck. Devastating trial and sentencing highlight emotional court moments. Nick's disbelief, the flaw of eyewitness misidentification, and the moment he hears the death sentence. The trial was as much theater as it was justice. Nick Yaris sat through, day after day, watching his life get torn to shreds for the world to see. A key eyewitness pointed at him in court, eyes uncertain, but the jury didn't seem to notice the hesitation inside. Nick burned with disbelief. He kept telling himself, surely someone will see the mistake. Someone will stop this. But the system ground on, indifferent and relentless. As the prosecution spun a story built on shaky testimony and jailhouse rumors, Nick wanted to shout his innocence, yet every outburst, every plea was painted as aggression. In the corner, his mother's face was streaked with tears. Even his father, a man who rarely cried, wiped his eyes. Nick was numb. Moments from the trial that cut to the bone, the eyewitness pointed to Nick, then looked to the prosecutor for reassurance. Prosecutors hammered on Nick's criminal past, not the facts of the case. His defense attorney fumbled and seemed outmatched. Nick whispered, "I didn't do this," more to himself than to anyone else. As the jury delivered its verdict, Nick squeezed his hands together. The words guilty echoed around the courtroom, bouncing off the marble and hitting him square in the chest. When the judge pronounced the death sentence, Nick's mind spun. He heard the words, but they felt far away like a radio broadcast from another room. Everything inside him collapsed. He watched his mother shaking as she realized her son would die in prison. A guard placed a hand on his arm. Even now, Nick remembers the guard's words, quiet, almost kind. "It's over, Yaris. You better start thinking about your soul." Voices from the dark, conversations in prison show intimate, humanizing scenes of Nick's first days and conversations on death row, including moments of raw despair and hope. Death row felt like another planet. The cell was small, colder than anywhere he'd slept before. Nick's first night, he pressed against the cement and cried, silent enough not to be heard. The weight of the sentence, the unreality of the trial, all bore down on him. The hum of fluorescent lights never fully faded, and then there were the voices of the men next to him, some already broken, some pretending not to be. One whispered from the next cell over, "First night's the worst, kid. You'll learn to forget the days." Nick did not answer for a while. When he finally did, his voice cracked. "How do I live with this, with what they say I did?" A raspy laugh returned. "You don't. You just keep breathing, or you stop. It's up to you." But even in that darkness, Nick found unexpected moments of connection. He traded stories through air vents with another inmate about life before prison. Sometimes a guard slid a book through the bars and said nothing, just a silent nod. Nick wrote letters to anyone who might listen, please, for legal help, notes of apology, scraps of hope. On rare occasions, laughter bubbled up, absurd but real, like when an older inmate offered to swap his dessert for a second pillow. "'Cause you'll need something soft in here, kid." Despite the endless grey, rays of hope found their way in. Nick made a vow not to completely lose himself to anger or despair. There were days he nearly broke, scrawling messages on the walls to remember who he was before it all began. When the doors clanged shut each night, Nick whispered the list of people he loved and promised he'd survive until someone finally listened. Years in hell, surviving the impossible. To survive decades in a cage, you have to give up parts of a self just to keep breathing. Nick Yaris passed 22 years on Pennsylvania's death row, most of them in total isolation, haunted by violence and the pain of being abandoned by the outside world. Each day became a fight to hold on to even a piece of his sanity, forced to invent reasons to live when there was nothing left but concrete and fear. Here's how he did it. How he clung to hope and meaning in a place designed to crush the human spirit. Isolation, abuse, and the fight to endure. Survival did not just mean keeping his body alive. It meant enduring attacks from other prisoners and guards, and facing a loneliness that stripped away every last comfort. The noise in prison was never-ending shouts, screams, the clang of doors. But the worst was the silence after. Daily terror was real. Nick was beaten by guards so badly he suffered detached retinas and lost teeth. Solitary confinement silenced him for years at a time. He went 14 years without touching another human being. Friendly faces vanished. Family and friends drifted away. Tired by the constant misery, letters stopped. He felt erased by the world. Nick described the mood. Sometimes I thought I could hear my own sanity creak, like an old stair before it snaps. Other inmates were sometimes sources of comfort, but often they were threats. Fights broke out over food, stolen items, or just the stress of being penned up. Abandonment hits hardest. At night, as the cell cooled, Nick would press himself against the wall just to feel something solid. If he screamed in frustration, no one answered. The toll of abandonment, sleep interrupted by nightmares and the constant threat of attack. Psychological games from guards who spread rumors, or threatened his last sense of dignity. despair building. In the dark, each year blending into the next, the world moving on without him. He once recalled to a journalist when they close the door and the lights go out, "Your only company is what you remember of being loved." Eventually, even that starts to fade. A flicker of hope, self-education and defiance, somewhere in the middle of all this. Nick realized he would lose himself if he only focused on what was being done to him. He needed a way to fight back, even if he could only do it with his mind. Teaching himself to read and write became his salvation. At first, he struggled, words twisted off the page, sentences a blur from battered eyes and a battered mind. But he persisted, using law books, scrap paper and dictionaries scavenged from the prison library. In this darkness, a defiant purpose took root. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, lawyers, journalists, strangers. Each note was both a plea for help and a declaration that he was still alive. Books became friends. Nick taught himself about forensics, law, philosophy, and stories of survival. The more he read, the more he felt himself grow. Language connected him, even across barriers. Sometimes a guard would quietly pass him a book or let a kind word slip, reminding him not everyone wanted him destroyed. On rare days, a cellmate slid scraps of poetry or legal tips under the door. "Keep your mind sharp," Nick, one wrote. "A dull blade won't make it here." Reading and writing weren't just skills. They were tools Nick clung to like a lifeline. They reminded him he was human, capable of thought and hope, not just a number in a system that wanted to forget him. "If I was going to die in here, I at least wanted my voice to exist in the world," he once shared. Moments of despair, wanting escape at any cost. But some days that voice faltered. Surviving didn't mean always being strong. It meant nursing wounds and grudges and longing for any escape, even death, when the pain became too much. Nick wrote openly about nights spent weeping, thinking about suicide. He described pacing his cell for hours, fingers raw from scraping at the walls. His mind cycling through every way out, legal or not. The pain was raw. He begged to be executed, writing to the governor, "Please kill me, I can't do this anymore." The urge to escape was overwhelming. Nick even managed a brief break from custody, carrying dreams of freedom on the run, even as he knew the odds were slim. The loss was physical, like aching bones in winter. Hope would visit, then vanish, leaving his cell colder than ever. He once confessed, "Sometimes I wanted to go to sleep and never wake up. I started to understand how people give in. You have to make yourself remember one more day might be the day someone believes you." But even in these moments, Nick hung on, if only by a thread. Small acts, scratching words on the wall, sharing a story with a neighbor, a fleeting touch during a transfer held him together. Survival was ugly, stubborn, sometimes fueled by rage alone, but day after day, Nick refused to let death row steal the last bits of his soul. This is the reality he woke to every morning and faced every night, not just a story of injustice, but the daily test of a man fighting to stay human behind endless bars. The DNA breakthrough, fight for freedom, the weight of a wrongful conviction, can crush nearly every part of a person, yet Nick Yaris never stopped fighting for one thing, the truth. When everyone else had given up, he clung to the hope that science's tiny strands of DNA might yet clear his name. His battle for freedom wasn't quick or smooth. It was built on stubbornness, heartbreak, and the idea that real proof could finally break his chains. Nick Yaris, the first to demand DNA testing in 1988. Nick Yaris did something almost unheard of for a person on death row. He asked for DNA testing, demanding that new science be brought into a courtroom obsessed with old facts. At the time, DNA technology was barely known in the American justice system. Most prosecutors, judges, and prison officials saw it as a flashy experiment, not a serious tool for justice. Yaris's request was bold, bordering on desperate. Some in power mocked his efforts. Others warned him not to get his hopes up. The district attorney's office pushed back, casting doubt on the idea that DNA could mean anything at all for his case. Nick refused to accept their dismissals. He wrote letters to lawyers, scientists, and legal aid societies, pushing his plea into the light. Many thought he was buying more time, not seeking truth. He faced cold eyes and clipped responses every time he mentioned DNA. "You'll die waiting." A guard once joked through the bars, but Nick was relentless even when he felt alone. He stubbornly repeated, "The truth is in the science. If you test it, you'll find me innocent." His decision would mark a turning point not just for his own life, but for the future of criminal justice in Pennsylvania. He was the first death row prisoner in the state to make such a demand, opening a small crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. Inconclusive results and crushing delays. Nick's persistence got results, but not the swift victory anyone dreams of. When the first DNA test was finally granted in 1989, it didn't clear him. The results came back inconclusive. A muddy answer that helped no one and left Nick caught in limbo. Even worse, vital evidence was mishandled or lost, making future tests even less certain. The emotional toll of these setbacks was immense. Every time hope surged, another delay or destroyed sample stomped it flat. Years passed as Nick dragged himself through cycles of hope and heartbreak. Evidence went missing from storage rooms. Some destroyed outright. Other samples came back to degrade it or for real answers. Miscommunications between labs and lawyers drew out the process for years. At one point, after a decade of wait, Nick's last appeal hinged on a handful of old evidence boxes. When another test stalled, he threw his head back against the cell wall and screamed in frustration. "How can they lose the last pieces that might save me?" he asked a friend on the row. During these lost years, Nick became a student of disappointment. He read legal documents until his eyes blurred, scrawled angry letters to the courts, and endured endless nights gnawed by the same question. What if the evidence was never good enough? And I die here anyway. Friends, legal volunteers, and even the occasional guard watched his struggle, many admitting later they were amazed at his refusal to simply give up. The science was getting faster everywhere, but on Nick's case, exoneration at last, the twist that saved his life in 2003, everything changed. After more than a decade of setbacks, a team of court-appointed lawyers helped secure one more DNA test. This time, the sample was small, but the method was better. Powered by new advances that could find answers even in degraded evidence. When the results arrived in July, the impossible finally happened. The DNA did not match Nick Yaris. It matched to unknown men. This simple genetic profile shattered 22 years of certainty for prosecutors, judges, and everyone who had doubted him. The court moved fast. On September 3, 2003, Nick's conviction was vacated. He became the 140th person in the United States to be exonerated by DNA evidence inside the courtroom. You could feel the air crackle with disbelief and relief. The judge read out the findings, eyes lingering on Nick for an extra second. Nick wept openly, fists pressed to his mouth. He later said it was like breathing air for the first time in years. His family, battered by decades of shame and sadness, broke into tears, clutching each other. They whispered, "We knew it, we knew it." One lawyer described the moment. You could hear people sobbing in the benches. It felt like we had all been holding our breath for 20 years. Nick looked across the room at the faces of those who had stood by him, his mother shaking, his friends stunned. Later, he told a reporter, "I could taste sunlight on my lips, even from the courtroom window. You can't kill the truth, not forever." After years of waiting, Nick was finally free, though the journey had left scars deeper than any cell walls. But that day in court, as the gavel fell, everything stopped. The fight for freedom had found its ending, and the truth finally had a voice. Freedom and bittersweet aftermath, Nick Yaris walked out of prison into sunlight for the first time in decades, but freedom was not a clean page or a true homecoming. The world had moved on, and Nick carried memories that never healed. The aftermath of his exoneration brought new obstacles, legal battles for recognition, the emotional fallout of lost years, and a struggle to reclaim health and dignity. No Hollywood ending, the struggle for restitution. Nick's exoneration did not open the doors to easy justice or compensation. In Pennsylvania, the law provides no automatic support for the wrongfully convicted. Unlike some states, there was no plan, no apology, and no check waiting to rebuild a stolen life. After his release, Nick faced a grinding battle just to be acknowledged and compensated by the system that broke him. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Delaware County, targeting those who contributed to his wrongful imprisonment. The case centered on accusations of malicious prosecution, evidence suppression, and a culture of indifference that left him on death row year after year. Key facts about Nick's fight for restitution: there is no automatic compensation law in Pennsylvania. For the exonerated, Nick didn't receive a dime upon release. He had to sue county officials in federal court for damages, arguing that they had acted with reckless disregard for justice. In 2008, after a long slog through the courts, Nick received a $1 million settlement. Even then, he called it pity money, a pale substitute for lost time, dignity, and family. His lawsuit revealed deep problems. Prosecutors had hidden or mishandled evidence and pushed ahead with a broken case, while Nick's own voice was ignored until science caught up with justice. For Nick, there was no celebratory montage or cheerful press conference. The battle for restitution was wearying, drawn out, and left him with fresh wounds. The law in Pennsylvania, to this day, still fails to guarantee automatic compensation to the innocent who are freed. Nick's case stands as a reminder that exoneration is not the end of suffering or struggle. It's often just a new chapter, marked by more courtroom fights and reluctant payouts, if any. Battling demons beyond prison, the fight on the outside could be even harder than surviving inside death row. Nick emerged into a world he barely recognized, his mind and body battered by years of isolation, beatings, and neglect. Every day brought a fresh burden, health troubles that dogged his sleep, memories that flashed back like lightning, and the sinking feeling of loss in every conversation. Nick's ongoing struggles include chronic health issues. Nick developed hepatitis C in prison, once believing it would kill him. Years of trauma and head injuries left him with a form of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE), a brain disorder linked to repeated blows to the head. Cognitive lapses and bouts of aphasia sometimes made basic communication hard. Emotional scars. Nearly a quarter-century on death row, much of it in isolation, left Nick with deep trauma. Nightmares, anxiety, and bouts of depression became regular visitors. Missing out on milestones, birthdays, funerals, love. Parenthood carved holes in his story that nobody could fill. Social alienation. The culture shock of re-entry was overwhelming. Nick had to learn how to buy groceries, navigate new technology, and rebuild connections. Many friends and relatives from his old life were gone or estranged. Stigma clung to him even as headlines told his story. Economic hardship. Despite the settlement, Nick faced ongoing money stress, legal fees, and a job. Market unwilling to embrace a man with a notorious history, even an innocent one. Constant reminders. Nick found that the trauma didn't leave after the cell door swung open. Sudden noises, confined spaces, and even the feel of sunlight could trigger flashbacks. Nick turned to advocacy and storytelling for healing. He wrote books, spoke to crowds, and tried to use his pain as a warning and a guide. Every speech, every page shared, was an attempt to wring meaning from wasted years to help others see that freedom isn't a guarantee of healing. Nick still struggles with his health and memory, but he uses his voice to demand reform for the next Nick YRRIS. In every interview. Nick's honesty stands out. He doesn't hide his anger or heartbreak. He once said, "Freedom is not just walking out the door, it's fighting every day not to let bitterness be your only companion." For Nick Yaris, the world outside prison is another test, but one he faces with the same stubborn determination. Finding voice, redemption, advocacy, and legacy. A life ripped apart by injustice rarely gets pieced back together. For Nick Yaris, the wounds of wrongful conviction came with brutal lessons about pain, about hope, and about refusing to be defined by betrayal. Yet, in the years after his exoneration, something powerful happened. Nick's voice, forged in suffering and silence, started changing lives through his gripping documentary, unfiltered memoir, moving conversations, and relentless activism. He pushed past old chains. Today, his story is not only a warning about broken justice, but a blueprint for finding purpose after loss. The Fear of 13, bringing the story to the world. Nick's experience might have vanished without a trace, but his choice to speak became a spark that lit fires around the globe. His memoir, 7 Days to Live, later retitled The Fear of 13, and the 2015 documentary of the same name are raw, haunting dives into a man's soul after unimaginable loss. The film is a masterclass in storytelling, told through Nick's direct, honest voice, using nothing but his words and memory. The narrative feels like sitting across from him in a darkened room, no filters, no distractions. Visually, the documentary uses minimalistic staging, keeping the focus on every gesture and pause. The effect is intimate, almost confessional. Dramatic scenes replay the torment. Nick's description of the moment he learned of his exoneration, his first free breath in the outside world, and his memory of falling in love with a volunteer while still behind bars. One of the film's most unforgettable sequences is near its end. Nick recalls singing as a child in church, and after 2 decades in solitary confinement, he sings the same tune softly in his cell. The contrast between innocence and agony makes every note ache. In that moment, the audience doesn't just witness a legal mistake, they feel the depth of what was taken and what, somehow, was reclaimed. When the stage adaptation starring Audrey and Brody debuted, the immediacy was electric. Brody's portrayal, built on hundreds of hours spent with Nick, became more than acting. At the close of a London rehearsal, Nick told Brody, "You took every punch, every kick I can let go now." No audience member left untouched. Both the memoir and documentary do what court records never could. They make Nick human again, alive in his pain, fury, and hope. Conversations that changed lives throughout his journey. Nick turned grief into dialogue that inspired hope in others. He doesn't sugarcoat what happened. Instead, he meets people in their suffering, showing how pain and possibility can coexist. Nick's words crackle with honesty and defiance. "I genuinely believe that being on death row for 22 years ultimately saved my life," he said. "It was the greatest adventure because I survived it." On the BBC, he confessed, "Sometimes I wanted to die, but I learned I could give away some of my pain by helping others carry theirs." In conversations with young inmates, Nick shares, "You wake up in a cell thinking hope is dead, but if you have a voice, you still have the chance to tell the truth." In an interview, he told a fellow survivor, "I try to offer hope to others, to be a loving human being. That's my greatest accomplishment. Everything else is noise. These encounters are not abstract." After a school talk, one young listener told Nick, "What happened to you could have happened to my dad. Thank you for making me see him with new eyes." Another prisoner who heard Nick said, "You make me want to live even behind bars, because your story teaches me that giving up is not my only choice." Whether on podcasts or stages or Instagram, Nick balances hard-earned wisdom with a straightforward challenge. Kindness is resistance. If I can forgive, anyone can. Are you ready to do the same? The Long Shadow and Nick Yaris's enduring impact. Nick Yaris did not hide from the fight after freedom. Instead, he turned his pain into a tool for change, and his story now lives at the heart of criminal justice reform. He stands as a living case study in the urgent need for DNA advocacy and the push to abolish the death penalty. Nick's ongoing efforts include regular public speaking on wrongful convictions, trauma, and hope, addressing law students, activists, policymakers, and anyone willing to listen. Advocacy work with projects like the Innocence Project, teaching about the necessity of post-conviction DNA testing. He emphasizes how science, not just belief, must drive justice. Open criticism of the death penalty, pointing out that the risk of killing innocent people cannot be justified, no matter how rare such mistakes are claimed to be. Working with international groups, from the United Nations to the European Union, to highlight the real costs of wrongful convictions and the moral power of redemption. Nick's legacy is not just in the headlines or courtroom victories, but in the new laws and growing awareness around forensic evidence, police accountability, and the irreplaceable value of human life. His message is simple and unrelenting. If they can do it to me, they can do it to anyone. Only truth found in science, law, and compassion can save us. Every talk, book, or performance plants a seed. Nick Yaris's story gives a human face to reform, teaching that even after the worst betrayals, a voice risen from pain can light the way forward. Nick Yaris's fight for freedom is a story that claws at the soul. You're stolen in a cell, pain that chews through the bones, and a system that nearly erased him. His ordeal demands empathy. Nick suffered every twist of betrayal, false informants, vanished evidence, and the slow grind of hope wearing thin. But against every crushing disappointment, he held on, taught himself, and shouted his worth into the dark. His journey proves that surviving injustice takes more than patience, it takes fire and defiant spirit. Nick's voice, once silenced by solitary walls, now warns us all. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. The fight against wrongful conviction never ends. Remember his pain, share his story, and stand guard against injustice, because truth and human dignity are worth everything. Thank you for walking with Nick through every heartbreak and hard-won moment of light. If this story stayed with you, pass it on. Let us honor courage with action and keep those wronged by the law from being forgotten.